Great. Welcome, everyone, to this installment of What Economists Really Do. I'm completely delighted to welcome Professor Ian Byrne, who's the Chair in Applied Microeconomics at the University of Liverpool. Ian does a range of really interesting research on the economics of discrimination, on, kind of groups, including older workers, women, but also the LGBTQ plus community. And today he's going to be giving us a bit of insight into the recent research in this area, a couple of facts, and also things that he'll be working on, hopefully some of those listening in the future. So Ian, over to you. Actually, I should say before that, please kind of keep an eye, please kind of include your questions in the Q&A as we go through, and I'll collect them. Ian will be talking for between 30 and 40 minutes. And then we'll be turning over to Q&A. The recording of this talk will be made public on the department's YouTube website. Okay, so with that housekeeping, Ian, over to you.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here talking about sort of LGBT economics. So just a little bit about me before we kind of jump into the research. So as you can tell, I'm not from the UK. My dad's from Yorkshire, but did not pick up that accent. So I'm from Delaware. No one can find it on the map, but Joe Biden's from there. So that's why you should at least vaguely have heard of it recently. I did my PhD at the University of California, Irvine. So broadly speaking, I'm a labor economist. So I don't do finance. I don't do the macroeconomy, GDP, inflation. I have no idea about those, much to everyone's chagrin in my family. I study labor markets. So how do people find jobs? So what's going on both in the workplace, but also on online job boards. So I'm a professor of economics at the University of Liverpool. I really focus when we think about this labor market on prejudice and stereotypes and sort of how do these influence economic outcomes. So both coming from employer side, but also how does knowing that employers have these stereotypes about people influence the way that people sort of look forward towards making choices in the labor market. So it's trying to understand both, workers and employers and how they navigate situations where there is prejudice and stereotypes against different groups. So what do I think economics is about? I think sort of economics can be anything because it's not really a study of any one field, but it's really a study of how do we allocate scarce resources. So when we have something that's not infinite, we have to make a decision about where does it go and who gets it and how we sort of allocate that, sort of determines all of these other things. So the way the macroeconomy works, the way the local economy works, even to when you go into the grocery store and try and figure out what do you buy. With cost of living, we've all experienced that walking into the grocery store and going, ooh, this is now more expensive. Do I really need, oat milk, or can I get the soy milk, which is 50 pence cheaper? And sort of those trade-offs that we make because money is scarce. So in the classroom, we always focus, and you'll hear, on money being the scarce resource. And so this is sort of that view that I think a lot of people have of economics being about money, is that it's just kind of easy to motivate economics and the scarce resource being money, because everyone kind of has an intuitive sense of having a budget and having to pick certain things to spend your budget. But, if we take a more broad view about what can be scarce, time is scarce. We have a finite amount of time. There's a finite amount of land in the UK or in the world, even less over time if climate change changes that. We have, limits on our attention span. We can't be focusing on all these different things. So the idea of scarcity and how do we allocate a scarce resource can actually be anything. So once you've mastered this framework of the optimal allocation of something that's scarce, it's actually quite flexible. So it allows economists to study things that people go, oh, why is an economist studying that? Because we're bringing a toolkit about our understanding of scarcity to a question, to understand the motivations of the various actors when they make that choice. So, once we kind of make an allocation, then that's kind of where the applied microeconomists come in. So we can examine sort of what happens once we've made these allocations, how do different agents react to different allocation schemes, And then importantly, how does the allocation of these scarce resources influence measures of well-being in the economy? So things like wages or health or life satisfaction. So sort of being an applied microeconomist is sort of taking this idea of scarcity, picking a handful of measures of well-being that we think are quite important, and then going out into the world to understand how the constraints of living, as it were, and making these choices are leading to differences between different groups, the effect of different government policies, and really giving us this rich understanding about how are the decisions we're making as day-to-day economic agents sort of influencing those around us. So LGBT economics is really rooted in this framing of the labor market. There's only so many jobs to go around, and you have to pick who gets them. Once someone has a job, you have to pay them a wage to do that job. And, companies want to make a profit. They don't want to lose money. So how they pay their workers is influenced by these overall budget constraints. So thinking about LGBT economics is really thinking about the economics of sexual orientation and of gender identity in this larger set of processes. So within this scarce resource paradigm, when we study marginalized communities, so thinking about gender, thinking about race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation and gender identity, we're really asking ourselves two big questions. So one is this group receiving fewer resources than we'd expect, given a set of variables that we're considering? And then why are they receiving fewer resources? Is it because someone's not giving it to them? Or is it that they just have a different preference for those resources? So thinking about sort of how the supply side of people willing to sell a product and demand side, people trying to buy a product, are interacting. So we have both individual taste and preferences, but also then the behavior of other economic agents. And so it's disentangling sort of the role of you, the worker in the labor market, and not liking certain jobs, to trying to understand a glass ceiling or discrimination in hiring or in a wage gap. So it's disentangling sort of these, everyone's making choices about how to allocate scarce resources, and it's just trying to understand how different choices are interacting in the overall labor market. So when we think about economics of sexual orientation and gender identity, it's broadly within this applied microfield, which means we kind of go out into the world and think about sexual minorities and gender minorities as economic agents and see the different markets that they're working in. So it's elements of labor economics, so thinking about the job market and trying to, how they work in the workplace, to health economics, which is thinking about sort of public health, population health, medical interventions, and the way they interact with healthcare services. To the economics of education, so how are they interacting in the production of human capital, which they then go on to use in the labor market, or economics of the household. So how are they organizing within a family to produce both children, which is sort of the main output function of households, but also optimizing, market production versus home production, bargaining over the allocation of these tasks, and sort of understanding the ways that these choices differ from heterosexuals or cisgendered individuals. So we know that, because of legal differences for many, many, many years, if you think of sort of, same-sex marriage wasn't legalized. So how does the lack of access to marriage change the allocation of household norms and bargaining norms within a household? Discrimination against sexual orientation was legal well into the mid-2000s. So potentially, how did those influence occupational choice, wages, And so the legal regime that same-sex couples, transgender individuals, and other sexual minorities operated under is different from those of cisgender and heterosexuals. So we can understand how the law changes these budget constraints or these choice sets that they're operating under, and then kind of use that to understand something about the law. So a lot of the key outcomes that people look at are kind of traditional economic outcomes on the applied micro side, but just through this lens of how have these institutional factors that led to a level of inequality between these two groups influenced these different dimensions. So in labor economics, we focus on things like wages, employment, poverty, and then occupational choice. In healthcare economics, we really think about mental health, HIV and AIDS, risky health behaviors such as smoking, drinking, or doing illegal drugs. And then within households, we think about things like fertility and the allocation of chores. So all of these are kind of economics. But at first glance, it's kind of unclear at times, I think, if you talk to someone and go, oh yeah, I study, X, Y, or Z, and it's not about finance, people are like, how is that economics? And it's economics because we're looking at the choices that people are making under scarcity and how this is working. So where do we get data on LGBT people? This has been sort of the defining problem of this field since the 1980s. I think people were interested in this field in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis. I think that sort of brought this to the forefront. And so if you look at the history of quantitative social sciences, it's not just economics that is interested in these topics. Sociology, political science, and public health were all quite fascinated on this. But, people didn't care to ask these questions when it was either illegal for many, many, many years, well into the 1960s in the UK and 70s later on, in many other European countries. So if it's illegal, the government's not going to ask you, hey, are you committing a crime? People aren't going to tell you, so it's not going to go on government surveys. And so when the AIDS crisis hit, there was no data. It just didn't exist. And you saw that damage that not having data was doing if we take a look back kind of from historical perspective, because without the data, we can't identify trends or patterns or figure out what's going on. It was just anecdotal. And so just anecdotes build and build and build, and eventually anecdotes do become data. But by the time that happened, it was too late. And, the epidemic was just ravaging, entire communities. And so from that experience, people started advocating in the late 80s and early 90s to be counted. The government can't use, oh, we didn't know as an excuse for inaction if they actually have the data. So it became a political purpose to collect this data, to be seen, to be counted, so that way the government had to care about you. And so from that, AIDS activism, we start getting the development of government surveys that ask this question. But it took many, many, many years. So beginning in the mid-1990s, accidentally, some design choices that were made, LGBT people figured out, hey, if we answer these questions in a certain way, we can be counted. So they made a choice in the US and in the UK data about 1990 to measure unmarried couples. So before, if you were living with someone and not married, the government didn't bother to ask if you were in a relationship. But then they were concerned about the rise of unmarried couples and understanding sort of what's going on with this. And so that sort of led to, oh, but they don't change the sex variables. So when we're not changing the sex variables, but you're asking us who we live with and who our partner is, all of a sudden same-sex couples enter into the data in the mid-1990s. And from that, we start getting quantitative data. And so from about the mid-1990s to mid-20 teens, that's all we have. Same-sex data, same-sex couples only. So once you enter into a relationship, you now enter into the data. If you're single, you're still a bit under the surface. But that introduces some problems. All of our knowledge of the LGBT population is the knowledge of couples. So how much of the patterns are we seeing are driven by couples and not individuals? And so from other sort of, reacting to this, it starts filtering through that we actually need a question on gender identity and sexual orientation. So the UK added it in the mid-teens. They started trialing it quite early under the coalition government with the ONS, and it took them many years to figure out the exact questions. Where do you put it on the survey? How do you deal with people who don't want to respond? So all of that research, took about a decade for them to really be confident in these questions. But what it meant was that when the latest census came through in 2021, they were like, well, we're going to include this. So for the first time ever, a UK census, and in fact, the first census in the world, to include this. We now have a full population count and we have 180 variables that we can connect to every single individual who filled out the census. So, for a limited variable space, we have a full population for the first time ever. And so from that, we're going to learn so much when this data starts, filtering through. And then in 2022, the Scottish census has it as well. So for Great Britain, we'll have a full population count. But all this did not come out of nowhere. This was really built on these earlier research in the government surveys. So in the UK, we have the Understanding Society. So this is panel data every 2 years, following households and individuals. And so it's really giving us a nice overview of the British population at regular intervals. And so it's quite detailed data. And so they added sexual orientation, in the mid-teens. I think 2018 is kind of the first wave that included it. And then the UK longitudinal cohort studies. So these are studies of individual cohorts, so people born roughly in the same month of a given year for 1958, 1970, 1989 to 1990, and then 2000. And so again, for the 2000, they waited until they were 18 to ask this question. But for these older cohorts, during the 2010s, they added this. And so now we have these rich data sets of panel data following same-sex couples in the early years, and now individual level data that abstracts away from couple status to give us something about the full population, including single people. So who is LGBT plus in England? I thought this was just interesting to show everyone, to give a sense. So in general, it's quite a small population, about 5 to 6%. So Kinsey kind of thought it was 10, which is a bit high for what we see in the population data. But traditional measures of 2 or 3% are also too low. So 5 to 6% is going to be a good guess. The majority are gay or lesbian. And then bisexual is also common, about equally shared, but slightly smaller. And then we have a whole host of other identities that are quite small, sort of pansexual, asexual, queer, or other, demisexual, sapiosexual, these other ones that pop up. So those are quite small, the individuals who choose to identify as that. It's mainly gay, lesbian, bisexual, when we look at sexual orientation. But this masks a very, very, very interesting age pattern. The younger you are, the more likely you are to identify. So that Kinsey number of 10%, which for many years we kind of thought was too high, is now all of a sudden looking not so unreasonable for young women between 16 and 24. So if you notice, the age gradient for women is extremely strong. I think it's stronger than many researchers kind of expected to see when we got this data. It was quite shocking to see such the strong age gradient that you have for women, because for men, it's pretty stable at about 4 to 5% for the younger cohorts, and then tailing off as you get older. And I think this dynamic pattern around age and identity is going to be something that, we're going to, we have the data now for once, so we can start digging into it. But, when you think of LGBT people, think usually gay, lesbian, dominant group, bisexuals also in the mix as the second largest, everything else, that plus, kind of quite small. And then who is it? They're quite young. They're more, so the younger they are, the more likely they are to be female. And then men, it's pretty stable. So where do they live? They live kind of where you expect them to live. But what's cool is because we have population data from the census, we can actually go down to, this is local authority, but you can go down to lower statistical output areas. So neighborhoods of about 3,000 houses, which is quite remarkable to have that level of gradient. So we can see that London is huge. And Lambeth Council is the second most. Lambeth and Brighton are the highest percentages. But if you kind of look where their other pockets are going to be, you're going to notice that it's where universities are. So we see pockets in Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, Cardiff, Portsmouth, Exeter, Plymouth, and Southampton. And that's just, universities, sort of collect these types of personalities. If we look in the north, we're going to see a similar pattern. Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, York, Newcastle, surprisingly Blackpool, which doesn't have a major university near it, but still has the second highest concentration in the north after Manchester. So highly urban areas with very strong universities is usually kind of the indicator for having an agglomeration of same-sex individuals. That's not to say that they only live there. If you look, you can see sort of in smaller towns, if we look in the north, bridging out from that M62 kind of highway, we're starting to see it in the suburbs down in Cheshire, down into Sheffield. So it's definitely, radiating along major, dense areas, but we're still seeing them even in the highly rural areas. So rural Wales is having it, rural England is having it. They're small, they're less than 1% of the population in these smaller areas, down to about 0.65%. But they're everywhere. And so it's actually, for the first time, though, we can actually see in highly granular detail where people are living. And that's giving us some really strong clues as to why people choose to live where they are. So LGBT economics, sort of began with a single question, and then the data has evolved around this question. And that very simple question was, what is the wage gap for gays and lesbians? In the early 1990s, there was a bit of a popular sort of stereotype that, oh, gays and lesbians are highly educated and have a lot of money. And that's just because that was who was coming out in the early 90s, was people with enough economic resources to weather the storm of prejudice. They didn't need to worry about losing their job because they're so high skilled that you're not going to fire them. So in the US, this isn't true in the UK, much to my chagrin, but in the US, the occupation with the highest concentration of LGBT individuals is university professors. About 13%. So if the population is about 5 to 6%, 13% of professors identify as a sexual minority in the United States. It's huge. As it shows, twice as common as in the population. And that's because it's highly autonomous occupations. But that meant that we're getting a false view of what the economic reality of sexual minorities are, is that if it's only this cultural imagination of high-powered, rich, gay white men in London, we're really ignoring the broader reality for people who don't feel safe to come out, who don't have the economic resources to gamble on being openly LGBT. So Lee Badgett at UMass Amherst was really interested in this idea. And so she really wanted population data on sexual minorities and their wages to understand, is this actually true? What is the wage gap? This wage gap is sort of this idea that how much do people make in two different groups and what's the gap between them? So if you think of the gender wage gap or the racial wage gap, it's sort of, it's a highly aggregate measure that's ignoring a lot of important aspects of discrimination, but it's a really good back of the thumb measure of discrimination. It's easy to explain, so I'll go into detail, and it's quite easy to explain. Policymakers get it very rapidly. And so, if the popular imagination is kind of saying, oh, the wage gap is zero, don't worry about it, Lee Badgett said, well, is it? Let's go look at it. So she used data from the General Social Survey, which had questions about your own sexual orientation and, your partnership history and your wages. So she was able to look at what's the correlation between being a sexual minority and your income, and ended up finding ginormous wage gaps on the order of about 30%. So with a popular imagination in the 1990s is saying, hey, gays are rich, don't worry about it, discrimination is not a problem, the data was now saying it's 30%. For every dollar a straight man makes, gay men make 30%. Interestingly, lesbian women were making more than heterosexual women. And so we have this interesting pattern where we're seeing a premium for lesbians over heterosexual women and a huge penalty. But again, it's on the order of about 30% for both groups. So a 30% premium for lesbian women, so they make 30 pence more on the pound, and then 30% penalty, so they're making 70 pence on the pound. So from there, the question became, well, is this a true result? How much of it is driven by the artifact of the specific survey? We really need more surveys to ask this question to, give us a better view. And so then sexual orientation was added to different surveys. The new census data around same-sex couples came out. And so from there, that simple question led to a very dedicated political push for more data, which then sort of influenced directly the gay rights movement, because a lot of the arguments of the gay rights movement were economic in nature, in a way that's very stark from other sort of, even if you think of racial equality, very rarely is the whole basis of the argument economic. I think that it was a strategic choice on the part of the activists that the economic argument was going to win the day over any sort of high-minded equality appeal to equality. The numbers are so stark that that is shocking to people, and we're going to make that the key sort of piece. And so from there, we sort of have evolved, now that the gay rights movement is a bit, I don't want to say over, but it's changing in a way that the obvious policy wins aren't really going to come through, the next stage. So we're moving towards asking different questions now. So how do we measure a wage gap? It's really simple. We take two individuals that we think are very similar and only differ in a specific characteristic, in this case, sexual orientation, and we ask, what's the difference in their wages? So it's the mathematical equivalent of finding the gap in wages between a gay man and a heterosexual man who have the same job at the same company with the same background degree at university. Now, no such pair exists, but with huge amounts of data, thousands of observations, we can create false little comparisons of this pair. So it may not be the same company, but it's a similar company. It's the same industry occupation pairing with the same region. So we can find approximate pairs and compare the two wages and then see how different they are. So we use a lot of math. We're economists. If we're not using math, then we might as well be sociologists. This is the key thing that sets us apart, is our love of math at the expense of everything else. Talking to people, no, economists don't do that. Give us data. But what we do is we say, okay, there's some relationship between sexual orientation, and all of these variables we care about, such as education, age, race, geography, and the wage that you're paid. We're applied to people. We're going to, make some assumptions to make things easier for us. So we're just going to assume a linear relationship. So if you're LGBT, your wages change by beta. So if beta is positive, it means that LGBT people earn more. If beta is negative, it means they earn less. Gamma is going to tell us how your education. If you're more highly educated and education increases wages, we should see a positive gamma. And so we can make sure that we're controlling for education, age, race, region that you live in, the year that the survey was done, everything else. So we chuck the kitchen sink into these regressions to make sure that there's nothing floating around that's correlated with both wages and sexual orientation, but isn't either of them. And so the only thing that differs between these two hypothetical people is their sexual orientation. So that beta is kind of the parameter when we think about wage gaps that economists are really obsessed with. So what does it look like for gays and lesbians? So this is going to plot data from about 2000 to 2018. So on the left-hand side, we have women, and you'll see that the lesbian premium was about 10% in 2000, and it's declining over time till in 2018, it's no longer significant. But again, notice it's a premium. So for much of the 2000s and 2010s, we're having, lesbian women receive more than a comparable heterosexual woman. And that's going to contrast quite starkly with what we see for men on the right-hand side. It's a penalty of about 8%, and it's fairly constant. It doesn't move very much. It wiggles around here or there, and that's just natural variation. But, no matter what's changed between 2000 and 2018, by and large, is actually, fairly stable. And so this kind of, you notice the asymmetry of this. That asymmetry has been actually a really important part of how, I do my research, is how do we explain this asymmetry? But it's also been a bit of a problem for researchers, I think. If we're trying to say, oh, discrimination against LGBT people is bad, and we have these huge wage gaps for gay men, when we have lesbians on the other side with a premium, it poses a bit of a problem rhetorically to be arguing discrimination against, LGBT people. Really what we have is discrimination against gay men, and employers actually prefer lesbians. And so finding a story that explains both of these patterns is sort of the holy grail, I think, of LGBT economics. So what have I been doing? I've been really thinking about, are there anything else floating around in the data that explains these patterns? Is there some aspect of another variable that I mentioned we can't see that's correlated with lower wages and sexual orientation? Or can we actually confidently say that this is explained by discrimination itself? So I have two papers that tried to answer these questions. The first is sort of, what's the role of homophobia in the wage gap? So, particularly thinking about, prejudice towards gay men, homophobia is not that so strongly targeted at lesbians. It's definitely a sort of dominantly focused on gay men. And then thinking about the role of femininity and masculinity in the wage gap. So the ways that, the gender identity and the gender nonconformity of the LGBT community, and how that interacts with the wage gap. So what's the role of prejudice? So there's a very famous theory about, wage gaps are driven by employer prejudice against minorities. Employers don't want to work with minorities. And so what they're going to do is they're going to offer them lower wages, and that lower wage is going to compensate for the psychic disutility they get from having to work with minority. So going back to 1990, I have state level data on questions about homosexuals in the United States. So these are questions like gay sex is morally wrong. Gay men shouldn't have books about gay men should not be in public libraries. Speeches in favor of gay rights should not be allowed in the public forum. And then homosexuals should not be allowed to teach at universities. And so we have all of those questions at the state level every single year going back to 1990. So I have sort of the changes over time and all the social effects. We see the variations as, the gay rights movement kicks off in the 1990s and really changes these attitudes. But it's changing the attitudes differently in different places. So, the wage gap is going to move on its own. It goes up or down. We saw those little movements. And then we have the changes in prejudice at the same time. So I was able to map the changes in the wage gap to the changes in prejudice. And so if prejudice is going down, in theory, the wage gap should go down. If prejudice goes up in the state, then the wage gap should go up. States that have higher prejudice on average should have higher wage gaps on average. So using sort of the trajectory of changes and the geography of prejudice and wage gaps, at the aggregate level, I was able to kind of disentangle these two effects. So, if we look at the actual correlation between prejudice and wages, about 30% of the wage gap at any given time can be considered due to prejudice. So 70% is factors that we don't quite know what they are, but 30% is prejudice. So, if we experience a decline in prejudice, we should see, about 30% of that feed through into declines in the wage gap itself. And then, what does gender nonconformity do? So this actually has been a huge problem for the literature because this gender nonconformity is that omitted variable that we're all worried about. We don't see it in the data. When we ask you your wages, we don't ask you sort of how masculine or feminine you are. So the argument based on stereotypes of LGBT people was always that, well, gay men are more feminine than heterosexual men. Lesbians are more masculine than heterosexual women. Therefore, if masculinity determines wages, what we're seeing when we see this asymmetry is not due to prejudice, but it's just unobserved masculinity. The fact that women, lesbian women get paid more is because they're more masculine, and then gay men get paid less because they're less masculine. So I had a survey of a bunch of high school students in the United States in the 1990s, and it followed them every 5 years to adulthood. And every 5 years, when they contact these individuals, they ask them everything. I mean, their political beliefs, their eating habits for the week before. They do a time diary, so we know when they worked out, what did they do when they worked out, so if they went out with friends, where did they go? Did they see a movie? Did they go bowling? So we have a really detailed perception of who these people are and what do they do with their friends when they go out. And also, how do they present themselves? Do you have piercings? Do you have tattoos? Where do you have piercings? Where do you have tattoos? You know, how do you, and so we have a question that actually says, you know, how masculine or feminine do you think other people view you? So that, you know, so we have their behaviors, we have how they self-assess that masculinity or femininity. And so what I'm able to do is to look at the survey responses and the behaviors, the preferences, and the activities that people do, to find, you know, whether or not gay men give answers that are much more like heterosexual women than heterosexual men. And so what we find in the data is that, you know, all of this is kind of pointing towards that, you know, men are men and women are women. The distributions are very different, but there is overlap in the middle. You know, so we have people who are, you know, kind of rejecting a lot of the gendered norms of behavior. And who's more likely to be in that sort of gray area between the two groups on survey responses? It's gay men and lesbians. So they definitely are more gender non-conforming when it comes to the activities they like to do, you know, how they behave, how they eat, their political preferences. All of it points towards them not behaving like the heterosexuals. So we have this whole distribution of survey responses. And so we're able to actually say, okay, for a gay man and a straight man that have the exact same survey responses and the exact same predicted probability of giving answers like a heterosexual woman, do we still see a wage gap? If masculinity is explaining this, then the wage gap should completely disappear once we condition on this masculinity parameter. You know, because we're kind of saying, okay, you know, we were ignoring masculinity. That was what was actually driving this. But now that we have it in the data and we actually put it into the mathematical models, if it explains it, it should be highly negative for gay men, but being gay on your own shouldn't be. And what we see is actually they both matter. So, you know, being more masculine does raise your wages. You work longer hours and you work more weeks and you work in more physically demanding jobs, all of which raise your wages. But even conditioning on that, the gay wage gap doesn't go away. It doesn't change. So these two things, yes, this matters. Yes, you know, it's actually quite interesting. You know, gender nonconformity itself is generating a lot of things, but it's doing it for gay men and straight men together. So the effects of gender nonconformity don't differ. And they're just completely different processes when it comes to employer determining wages or who to hire. So it's really interesting that, yes, this is an omitted variable. It's important for wages, but it's not differentially important. And even conditioning on it doesn't remove the wage gap. So when we're talking about that wage gap, it actually is much more likely to be due to prejudice than these other omitted things. You know, no matter what we find, we put it in, it doesn't change it. That wage gap is quite stable. So, you know, I think a lot of the focus has been on that wage gap. So as I wrap up, I just kind of want to broaden it out and kind of say, well, where's it going now? I think a lot of it is now thinking about a more life course aspect of sexual orientation. So thinking about how outcomes are evolving over time, how different outcomes are interacting, and using the timing of different life events and timing and the changes of outcomes to leverage it for identification of how does sexual orientation interact with a lot of these major life events. So thinking about things like schooling, you know, we know that gays and lesbians obtain more years of education than heterosexual individuals, but bisexual individuals obtain less. And so we know that anticipated discrimination is actually a driver of this. People think they're going to be discriminated against in the labor market, so they get more schooling. You know, so we see then that feed into differences in what fields you pick, what, you know, occupations do you go into. And then for marriage, again, we're seeing differences in, you know, single couples and married couples, but we've never had marriage be randomly given to people before. It's always been this institution that is so endogenous to the way we live our lives and the culture that we're in, that studying the effect of marriage on outcomes has been impossible. So now all of a sudden researchers can use the rollout of same-sex marriage to study the effect of marriage and really understand the mechanisms behind what does marriage do to economic outcomes. And then finally, and this is where a lot of I'm bringing together that work that I do with, older individuals and the LGBT community to understand, what's the effect of living under all of this LGBT discrimination for so many years in the 1980s and 1990s on later life outcomes. Just because we've, gotten rid of a lot of the prejudice and it's actually quite small, nowadays compared to what it was back in the 80s and 90s, that doesn't mean that we don't have to worry about differences in outcomes anymore. So if we look at LGBT populations who are retiring, so they're in their early 60s, late 60s now, you know, they had 20, 30 years in the labor market with very high levels of prejudice and discrimination. So what does that do to outcomes? Well, it gives them smaller pension pots, it gives them more health problems, and importantly, they have more social isolation. So they get less help from their families when it comes to caring responsibilities, and they feel more alone in their later years, which is really damaging for health outcomes of elderly individuals. So where do I think people who are interested in this field, especially those younger people who are going, should I become an economist? I think where we're going is better empirical methods. Applied micro is always thinking about how do we, better measure what we're interested in measuring. So how do we use experiments to better study prejudice and discrimination? And now a lot of the work is thinking about machine learning. So we have really complex issues for LGBT people thinking about coming out, or who gets clocked as gay, or can you pass as heterosexual. All of those processes are actually mathematically quite complex. I mean, you really need high powered computing to answer these questions, and lots of data. So you need big data, you need very powerful computers to solve these mathematical problems that are posed by such a simple thing as the decision to come out. And so I think that's where a lot of really innovative work in the field is going, is that highly mathematical machine learning, but with this very interesting question of such a simple question of what's the economics of coming out in the workplace. And then I think a lot of it is thinking about, the census data and other data sources that are quite big and the growing size of the population. As I pointed out earlier, we, in the 16 to 24 age group, the LGBT population is the largest it's ever been. So if that feeds through the rest of their lives, then we're going to get a lot more data than we've ever had before. So small populations like transgender individuals or non-binary individuals actually become a viable group that we can study, because before, if we only have 10 to 20 of them in a survey of 10,000 people, we just don't have enough data. We can't tell, the math won't tell us anything interesting. But if we get hundreds or thousands in these large data sets, well, now all of a sudden we can start looking at this. So administrative data that's giving us full population counts on even, really small populations, we're actually having enough data now to ask these interesting questions. And the nice thing about if you jump on one of these, new data sets that lets you look at these smaller groups is that you're the first person to look at it. So you just have to go back to what we've done since the 1990s and start following your way through. The path has been blazed when you think about the study of gays and lesbians, and you just have to follow it for transgender or non-binary individuals. And that, I think, is fascinating, because even if you start with the idea, oh, I'm just going to follow what other people have done, you actually start seeing the differences. And then that starts a new conversation, and you learn more by kind of replicating the past and moving forward from there. And so I think it's always, no matter how much we learn, there's always so much more to learn, and comparing and contrasting is kind of the bread and butter that I think drives a lot of that learning. So I'll stop there.
Ah, great. Thank you so much, Ian. That was completely fascinating. I learned a lot through that, and hearing more as well, I guess, about the kind of the political economy of measurement and just the development of actually how these different identities have been captured in surveys over time was, anyway, the whole thing was great. So thank you so much. So everyone put questions in the Q&A. So looking at those that we have currently, I think I'm going to start with, there are a couple of questions essentially about selection into reporting, I guess, in these surveys. And one thing I was also especially struck by was in the data that you showed at the beginning, with the proportion identifying as a sexual minority by different age groups for men and women, you see this kind of very striking kind of age gradient for women. And as you were saying, not so much for men. And so I guess one question is just that, you know, on one level, how do you interpret like kind of those patterns? Do we think that something different is going on with reporting? Do you know of anything about why that might have affected the different gay and lesbian communities?
I mean, that spike for young women is always fascinating. I first noticed it probably 6 years ago. So before the full census came out, this in that panel survey I was showing you from the 1990s, we actually see the same spike. So these are women who are now in their 40s. So compared to earlier cohorts, even for women in their 40s, we're seeing it. And if you take that 1995, you know, they were high school sophomores, so, you know, grade 13, or sorry, grade 9-ish in the US, if you graduate at 12 and go to university after 12. So they're about 8 and 9, you know, grades. And so what you see if you follow that cohort, you know, for their mid-20s, is that bisexuality amongst women is actually extremely fluid. So we have a group of lesbians that looks very similar in that cohort to the gay men and bisexual men. And that's just kind of like, you know, 5%, you know, they identify as that, and it never changes. But then you have this group of bisexual women, and it's actually super fluid. So in one wave of the survey, they'll be bisexual. The next, they'll be mostly heterosexual. And they sort of move between the Kinsey scale. You know, they're all on the bisexual to heterosexual side of the scale, but they're quite fluid across ways of how they move. And then eventually it tails off in their late 30s, early 40s into a much more traditional measure of heterosexuality that's quite stable. But that female experimentation, especially in your 20s, is actually quite unique to this cohort. But now that we're getting other data sets, we're starting to see it. So it seems to suggest, if you take the psychology literature seriously, that female sexuality is a bit more fluid than male sexuality. Male sexuality is very, very sticky and stable. It does not move. And that what that means then for who identifies and the selection into it is that it's actually super complex. We're not really good at thinking about it because, as I said, the mathematical models go absolutely haywire because you have probabilistic thinking on the part of an employer guessing versus someone who has to then make the game theory. So it's just multidimensional chess of this game in an interview. The thing is, that's the real world. It is complex, but mathematically, when we only have 5% of the population and we only see them annually, we never have enough data to really dig through this. And so that's where the big data from these huge admin data sets is becoming really important because it's giving us enough data to really think about these issues, you know, in a way that's actually, you know, we formalize our thought process around this. And so I think in general, the way you think about this is that it is a bit of an intent to treat measure. You are assuming that when someone identifies as it, everyone then knows. And that's not necessarily a realistic assumption, but what it means is that there's two ways it can go. It can either be, these are the people with the best possible outcomes. So if the other people come out, everything gets worse. So for lesbian women, we probably then start seeing a penalty emerge. And then for gay men, the penalty gets worse. Or you can kind of think that this is the people who can't hide. So this is the worst case scenario, as it were, as the other people came out, you know, their unobservables would pull the wages up towards more similarity. And then, so, you know, you'd actually then see sort of the wage gap disappearing. I think if I look at if we think gender and feminine gay men versus masculine gay men, broadly defined, is a very big distribution. So when I say those, I'm first quartile to fourth quartile is kind of what we're talking about. I know, you know, this is very highly aggregated and mathematical things made simple. So just caveats everywhere. But when you think about that, you actually don't see huge differences in what we're seeing. So both in who's coming out to their employers and who's kind of how they think other people perceive them. So everyone's kind of reporting very similar things along the gender conformity distribution. So I don't know. I think that's kind of
No,
the fun. It is
that
what is the answer to that. It's complex, and we know kind of what it could do, but in each of the particular contexts that we study, we don't quite know yet.
That's interesting, both that it's complex, as you were saying, both in terms of the nature of the identification and the categories and the fluidity, and then, of course, the complexity in terms of then its interaction with the workplace and the kind of general workplace interactions. And that kind of leads on to there are another couple of questions which are really thinking about, as you were just talking about, how do we interpret some of the wage gap results that you're showing in terms of lesbians having a kind of positive kind of bump relative to heterosexual women, and the opposite for gay men. So there's a couple of questions about, does this interact at all with how we think about childcare and I guess
Which is
family?
exactly what
Maybe
it
I'll
is.
start. Yeah.
That's 100%. So not to shade men, but men, when they have kids, don't change. Their labor supply patterns constant. So when gay men don't have kids, I mean, fewer than 10% of gay men have children. Um, and so, 95% of gay men don't have fertility to kind of interrupt things. So they behave identically like most heterosexual men. So there, we're not seeing any differences. But for lesbian women, fewer of them have, less than half of them have children. Um, and so they have even if they do have children, interestingly, if you look at we have this famous Clevin paper at All paper that looks at what happens to wage gaps within a couple as they have children. So for women, they take a huge hit in the first year, and then it takes them many, many, many years to slowly recover to reach back that peak, but they never catch up to their husbands. The growth is just they're just parallel from then on out. So the gap induced by childbearing creates a structural wage gap for women. We don't see that in lesbian couples. Lesbian couples catch back up to the partner that didn't have the child very quickly. Within 3 to 4 years post-child, they're back together, moving at the same wages.
Wow.
So lesbian women allocate childbearing a lot more evenly, or within the household, because a lot of times they alternate who has the child. So because both of them will eventually have a child, both of them will eventually see that decline. So what we see though is that if you look at lesbian women who have children, they look extremely similar to heterosexual women. There is no premium in that group. If you look at lesbian women who don't have children, and never, didn't leave the labor market, that's kind of what is driving it, is that for many, many years, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, before IVF became such a common thing for all women, we have structural barriers to IVF in the early 2000s, both from technology and public health. As we loosen those in the 20-teens, we start seeing that decline. And that's driven by increases in lesbian fertility. And so being a lesbian is no longer such a strong signal that they won't leave the labor market to have kids. So the value of the lesbian premium starts declining due to changes in fertility behavior to more equalize to heterosexual women.
That's really fascinating. That the kind of last question I think we've got time for, I'm going to kind of again is partly about this interpretation of wage gaps, but also thinking about what that then implies about who's going to, if you like, kind of reveal their sexuality in the workplace. So I was wondering, I guess I'm going to kind of put two bits to this question. So one is there anything that you know of sort of at a workplace level, or kind of thinking about what are the features of workplaces themselves which might make a kind of an environment more or less inclusive? And then again, this might be too much, but then connecting some of this to the graphs you were showing about the geographic dispersion, like, so basically you get much high, lots of people kind of tend to congregate in particular cities. I was wondering if you know anything about whether that's also true for particular types of firms, and whether that's something about feeling, well, the combination of feeling comfortable versus homophily.
Yeah. So I'm going
Sorry.
to break it up,
It's a lot.
just because. So if we think about the geographic clustering, a lot of it's driven by the occupations. So autonomy is the name of the game when it comes to what do LGBT people pick for occupations. They don't like having bosses that have a lot of control, which kind of works if we think of the theory that if prejudice is driven by employers not liking you, if you are more autonomous, there's fewer ways that your boss can influence your productivity, your wages, your own production process. So, you can sort of do your job on your own, produce this output that is then judged, and you're paid for that output. So that autonomy aspect versus people who have to work in close collaboration with a boss who's overseeing everything. The types of jobs that have that high autonomy are going to be in certain types of firms, in certain types of industries. And those will usually be knowledge worker or highly skilled occupations that have low routine work patterns. Nowadays, work from home is certainly becoming part of that autonomy aspect. And so those are going to cluster in certain types of cities because of the agglomeration economies in the knowledge economy. But it's also going to explain certain types of firms. So firms that structure themselves around worker autonomy as a way of deriving excess surplus versus the more control of management to generate that worker surplus is going to give you those differences and where people sort. But there's, I say economists love data, sociologists love qualitative data. They actually go talk to people in a way that economists is always scared to. And so there's amazing research out of the University of York where they worked with the NHS to understand the role of diversity groups, and so LGBT staff groups, and how those operate, and sort of how does that all lead to senses of staff well-being in terms of coming out in the workplace, in terms of the relationships between managers and staff members, and how does management sort of build their diversity plans around staff groups and leveraging, what are they thinking about, on both sides of the coin. And so there's a lot of really cool work, I think, within sociology that thinks about within the industrial relations sphere, how does diversity and inclusion, especially for sexual minorities, kind of interact with a lot of these things in terms of giving you that safe place to come out. And what does that then do towards your sense of productivity, your sense of belonging, how long you stay at the firm versus do you switch? So there's a lot of things that we'll see in the data that is actually being derived from these in-work human processes that just don't enter the data.
Ian, that was absolutely fantastic. Sadly, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions and for tuning in. We'll be posting, as I said, the video online on the department's YouTube channel, along with some of the links to some of the readings that Ian suggested. But thank you so much again, Ian, and hopefully see you all at another What Economists Really Do soon. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.